All right. Well, we're about 2 or 3 minutes after 5 o'clock Central, 6 o'clock Eastern. So we're going to get started. I want to take a moment to welcome everybody to the third in the USARA Distinguished Speaker Series. These have been great so far. We're very excited to have with us tonight Major Jeremy Noble. Major Noble has served or had previously served with the Ranger Regiment as its psychologist from 2016 until the present, so just about 5 years. In that capacity, he has worked with RASP 1, RASP 2, FG RASP, and other groups. He has been involved in executive coaching, psychotherapy, and the psychological assessment involved at the regiment, as well as with command consultation. He's airborne qualified. He's deployed to Afghanistan 7 times in support of Rangers and Ranger operations, and is now in the process of leaving the regiment and heading up to work with the Special Missions Unit in DC. So we appreciate your time tonight, Jeremy. Thank you very much for joining us. And with that, I'll give you the floor.
Okay, awesome, Travis. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks for having me as a speaker. So as Travis said, I just finished out my time as the regimental psych on Friday. So I'm feeling a bit nostalgic. So this is perfectly timed. And also, I do have to include the obligatory disclaimer that all the views that I present in the presentation are solely mine. They don't represent in any way the 75th Ranger Regiment, the U.S. Army, or the government, which I'm sure everyone here has heard that plenty of times. So to start this off, I just want to lay kind of the groundwork. So a few months back, I was at a RASP 2 board, and I briefed the board on a candidate who had some post-traumatic stress symptoms. And for the board, I wrote down what PTSD was and what the implications for hiring the individual was, so the board could make a well-informed decision about the candidate. And our honorary regimental Sergeant Major Mike Hall was there at the board, and afterwards he pulled me aside and asked if I'd provide a similar breakdown for this group, because he thought it could be beneficial for the group to hear. And so that's going to be the topic tonight. Is we're going to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, but more specifically, I want to hit on 3 major areas of the talk. So one is I want to demystify what PTSD is and explain what it is and what it's not. I'd also like to discuss how it's treated. And then more importantly, I'd like to discuss ways to treat it or ways to engage in self-therapy or formal therapy if you are experiencing any symptoms or any of these things. So to start off, the very first thing is what is PTSD? And I like to tell people that PTSD is actually the body doing what it's designed to do, and that's to survive. And I'll explain what I mean. So there's 3 major components of PTSD. The first one is there's exposure to an extremely traumatic event, and this is usually I'm sorry, Charles. I think we're having some technical difficulties. Are you have now?
Yeah, I apologize for that. It looks like we got you bumped down off of the panel for a moment there. You should be back up now and live. I apologize for the technical difficulties.
Yep, no problem. No problem. So what I was saying, so PTSD is the body doing what it's designed to do, and that's really to survive. And there's 3 major components of it. One is that there's exposure to an extremely traumatic event. And this is usually something that's life-threatening. And following exposure to this event, there's re-experiencing of that event through things like nightmares, thoughts you can't get out of your head, or even physiological reactions to reminders of the event. So the classic, veteran that's at a like 4th of July firework event, and they have this intense sort of reaction to the fireworks. That's an example of that re-experiencing sort of reaction. And then the third one is probably the most important one of all. And that's where you do your best to avoid those reminders of that traumatic event. And again, this is normal human behavior. Animals do this. This is something that is completely normal and part of being a human being and part of survival. So think about that for a second. So if you have a near-death experience, your body automatically takes these meticulous notes on everything associated with that situation. And by everything, I mean anything that your senses pick up. So sights, smells, sounds, everything around that event. And it takes those notes and it puts them in a file that it labels in all caps danger. And then it does its best to avoid similar situations in the future. And the whole reason for that is to heighten the likelihood that you're going to survive in the future. That way you're less likely to be in that situation again in the future, because you're going to avoid those things that are associated with danger. So there's nothing wrong with this. It's an adaptive mechanism. If we weren't programmed this way, that the human race would have been extinct a long time ago. But it becomes problematic when that avoidance becomes too overgeneralized and it applies to things that aren't actually dangerous. And when it interferes with your ability to live your life, that's when it actually becomes a disorder. So I have a big book of mental disorders that sits on my desk, and almost every one of those has one criteria in common, and that is that it has to result in an interference with your life. And so you can have these symptoms, but if it doesn't interfere with your life, it's not technically a disorder. So I want to give you guys an example of how this plays out. And so I'll use a non-combat related example. So let's say someone stops for gas on his way home from work one day. And while he's sitting out of his car, he's standing outside of his car pumping gas, someone else comes and sticks a gun to the back of his head and robs him. Everything associated with that event is going to go into that danger file that I mentioned before. So the smell of gasoline, him physically standing outside of his vehicle, the sound of the gas pumping in his car, the cars whizzing by on the highway, all this stuff is going to get associated with a dangerous, with danger. And so the next time this person has to pump gas, his heart rate is going to be more elevated than usual, because his body is telling him, hey, hold on, you're in a dangerous situation. Last time you were here, you almost died. And so when the next time he pumps gas, he may stand with his back to his car and then constantly kind of scan the surroundings rather than sort of face his car and leave himself vulnerable. Because this is to decrease the likelihood that a similar incident is going to happen again in the future. However, let's say the next time this individual needs to stop at a gas station, his anxiety is so high that he decides that he's going to fill up later. He decides that hey, I'm not going to do it today. I'm going to wait. I'm at a quarter of a tank. I can wait a few more days, and he decides he's just going to kind of skip the gas station. Well, that decision is an extremely important one, because he just engaged in a behavior that made his anxiety temporarily go away. And I say temporarily because the next time he's faced with this decision to fill his car up with gas, his anxiety is going to be even higher than what it was the first time. And if he avoids that gas station again, then that cycle gets even stronger, and it increases the likelihood that he's going to avoid putting gas in his car. And if you really take that to the extreme, if somebody avoids putting gas in their car altogether, then they can't go to work, or they start bumming rides off of friends, and it becomes problematic. And so at this point, we've surpassed the point of adaptive for survival, and now it has become post-traumatic stress disorder. It's someone avoiding things that remind them of a traumatic event, to the point where it interferes with their life. So that brings me to point number 2, and that's, how do you treat it? As you can see from that example, PTSD is not a blood disease. It's not something you just get and you can never get rid of. It's a set of learned behaviors that become problematic for someone. And the beauty of learned behaviors is that they can be unlearned. So let's take the gas station example again. The very next time the person had to fill his car up with gas following the robbing or the mugging situation, instead of avoiding the gas station, if he would have made himself go to the gas station, Even if it was just to sit in his car at the pump and not actually get out, then he would have taken one step in that direction of recovery and getting past that traumatic event. And each and every subsequent time that he actually pumps gas, it would get easier and easier and easier for him. And it would eventually reach a point that we call in psychology, we call it extinction. So reach a point where the body no longer associates the smell of gasoline with danger. So he breaks that association between those two things. This is a hypothetical example, but the same mechanism applies to combat-related trauma. Exposure to reminders of the event, whether it's physically being around those reminders or talking about past events, exposure is the gold standard to recovery. And that's what we do in treatment is we harness that exposure with someone. Now, I'd like to add that there's another variant of PTSD that it's less physiological, it's more psychological. And I do want to touch on this because I think this is an important one for our population. Some refer to this as a moral injury. And so this refers to someone who they still witness a traumatic event, but what's different with this one is that they feel like they had some part to play in causing the event to happen or not preventing it from happening. With this one, there's a lot of guilt. There can be some depression associated with it. The treatment is pretty much the same, but for the exposure, it's going to be much more discussion based. So there's much more discussion around the traumatic event and sort of processing what happened. And with this one, the individual often changes their belief about themselves or about the world. So for example, someone might have been involved with a civilian casualty downrange. Instead of acknowledging the incident as a mistake or some of the other factors that surround the incident, the person might shift their view of themselves as being a bad person or being an evil person, even though this is an irrational belief. So the goal for treatment there would be to process what happened and then to analyze how the event has really shifted their view of themselves and about the world. But bottom line is exposure is the way to go, whether talking about it or actually physically putting yourself in those uncomfortable situations. And so that leads me to my third point, and that's if you are experiencing any of this stuff, given your history in an organization as great as ours, the first question to ask yourself is does this interfere with my life? If it doesn't, then it's not technically a disorder. There's nothing to worry about if it doesn't cause any kind of disruption in your life or any issues there. I get a lot of people that ask me, hey, am I just going to go crazy one day? And despite what the movies will tell you, that doesn't happen. You don't just, because you've been exposed to combat, one day you just lose it. There's other things that lead up to that. And most of the people on this call, when most of the people are older than the age where you would actually have a psychotic break, most of the folks, if they're going to have a psychotic break, it's going to happen for men in their early 20s. And so you're beyond that. So no worries there. But so if it doesn't, again, so if these things don't cause problems for you, then there's nothing to worry about. If they do, then my top recommendation is always going to be to seek treatment. There's some really good PTSD treatment protocols that are quick and effective that are offered by the VA. Actually, the VA is mandated to provide these treatments because they're proven to be effective. And so 10 to 12 sessions, and you might be surprised at how much of a difference that would make. If you're not interested in formal treatment, but you experience some of this stuff, you can also do your own exposure therapy. And what I mean by that is you can create a list of situations that make you anxious, or create that fight or flight response, that response where your heart's racing, your adrenaline's rushing. Create a list of those situations and then rank order each item on that list from least anxiety provoking to greatest. Start with the least anxiety provoking situation and then expose yourself to it. And when I say expose yourself to it, you have to sit in that fight or flight mode for an extended period of time. So either until that feeling kind of goes away or reduces, or for about 45 minutes or so. But an important point here is that it always goes away. Your body cannot stay in fight or flight mode forever. So at some point that anxiety is going to peak and it's going to come back down. And if you train your body that if you just sit in it and you don't avoid it, then you're going to train it. You're going to get that extinction effect that I mentioned earlier. You just have to repeat it over and over again until you no longer want to avoid that first item on your list anymore. And once you tackle the first item, then you move to number 2 on your list and repeat the process. And you do that over and over and over again until you tackle the very top thing on your list. Now, again, top recommendation is treatment. So see a professional if you're going to do this. But if you don't, I still want you to have the tools to be able to address it. But if you do decide to do this on your own, it's going to be extremely important to maximize your defenses. So what I mean by that is get your sleep squared away, have a strong social support network. Wouldn't be a bad idea to do this with a friend or somebody who went through a similar situation as you. Make sure your exercise regimen is on par. Get your diet right. Like you're gonna have to essentially get on a mental health training program and treat it like you would any other PT program, where you assess your baseline, you dedicate time daily to it, and then you track your progress. And then, in a few months, you might be surprised where you are. So I'm gonna stop there because I know I'm out of time, but I know we want to leave plenty of room for questions. So I'll pause there.
Thank you, Jeremy. For those of you who may be attending for the first time and have not participated in one of our speaker series before, you can feel free to put any questions that you have for the panelists in the Q&A feature. If you scroll to the bottom of or move your mouse to the bottom of the page, it'll bring up a bar, and on that bar there will be a button that says Q&A. Feel free to enter any questions that you may have for the panelists there. Jeremy, I'm wondering, maybe to kick things off, if you can give some sense as to what kind of levels you're seeing of mental health issues at the regiment, or that you did see over the last 5 years, and maybe some of the things that you were able to bring to the table to help our young Rangers deal with those types of struggles that they're experiencing.
Sure. Yeah. So first off, we have a extremely resilient population. We do RASP, so we already have that filter, in the gate. So we get a group of individuals, much like everybody, I'm sure, in this chat, that you're already at a higher level of resilience, and so we don't see the same levels of mental health issues that you ordinarily would with the rest of the Army on the civilian side. However, we also have a population that has been running and gunning since, since the beginning of the war. And so we get people who are extremely overworked and overwhelmed and stressed. And so honestly, the stuff that I've seen more of has been more of stress management, more of some depressive symptoms, more of relationship issues, more so than PTSD. I still see PTSD. But it's been more so of those things. And so one of the things I like to do that I found very effective, and it can be applied to this situation too, is it's called behavioral activation. But basically what it is you have somebody identify what they value. So you have them identify what things do they find important in their life. And I like to break it up into a few different life areas. So education, career, relationships, leisure activities, mind, body, spirit kind of stuff, and then daily responsibilities. And so I have them identify, like, what do they find important in those areas? So is being a supportive husband one of your values? And if it is, then they identify specific measurable activities that are in line with those, and then they plug those into their schedule. Somebody who's depressed, when you look at somebody, if you put a camera on somebody who's depressed, they usually don't do anything. And because they don't do anything, they're not doing these behaviors that they get fulfillment out of. And so their depression gets worse. And so if you can get them to plug into their schedule these behaviors, these activities that they find fulfilling, then their mood improves. I'd say that's one of the things that I've found pretty effective with this population, because these guys are very much go-getters, and they like tangible things to grab onto. If that answers your question, Travis.
Sure. A second question that commonly comes up, and I relate to my personal experience. When I was in the regiment 20 years ago, it was don't go to sick call. Don't go talk to anybody about your problems. Keep it to yourself, because if you show a sign of weakness, that is a crack in the wall. That's an invitation to be to be asked to go to another unit or to leave the regiment. And I sort of understood that perspective when I was a young Ranger. Now in my professional civilian life, I'm an attorney that works with veterans' disability claims, and we commonly run into circumstances where we're dealing with people who experience issues, often mental health issues at a younger age, but there's no record of it anywhere because there wasn't a system in place, or they were discouraged from allowing a record to be created because they didn't want to jeopardize their careers. We are starting to see some changes on the lawyer side, working with disability claims. We're starting to see some changes in some units that deal with that issues. There are some units in particular that are starting to get better about making sure things like that are recorded. But I'm not saying we don't get a ton of clients that come out of the regiment, and so it's hard to know what young soldiers and young Rangers are doing on that front, and what the medical staff and the professional staff is doing to help them. Has that become a focus of what you guys have been working on to help Rangers? Some sense as to what they might need in order to succeed in their next stage of their life after they get out of the Army and after the regiment, and what sort of things are y'all doing in order to make sure that they're taken care of on that front?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest thing that we've done is the regiment's implemented a holistic health assessment program where our senior NCOs and our folks that have been around for a while that have been doing this for so long and they're kind of beaten up, they come in and they hit everything. They hit behavioral health, they hit physical therapy, they hit everything, and all the stuff gets documented. I mean, we're trying to change the stigma around it. I mean, there's a stigma, like you said, Travis, of if you go seek any kind of treatment, then you're going to get asked to go to another unit. And that's really not true. Like I have, when I brief candidates at a RASP board and I brief that they've had a history of treatment, I brief it as they're utilizing the resources available to them. And I actually see it as a strength, as opposed to someone who comes in, they've had some issues, but they've not addressed them. And so one of the ways we're addressing it is the holistic health assessment program, where folks are coming through and it's like a tune-up, it's their high performance vehicle. They're coming in and getting it checked on, once every so often. We're also making some efforts on the behavioral health side, where we're dispelling some of the myths. Like, people think they're going to lose their security clearance if they seek behavioral health treatment. It's not true. And so we're putting some of that stuff out there. And then I've also recently, we separated out the place where we do interviews for RASP and the place where we see people for treatment. And that was kind of a big red flag for me. Initially, it was an oversight for me. We had some NCOs go through RASP and they had sought treatment previously, but they did interviews in the same building and they felt like all that stuff was being used against them in RASP, even though we don't mix the two. We just had the same location. And so we've acquired another building and we do the interviews in another building. So the stigma is always going to be there, but we're doing our best to try to reduce it.
Thank you. It looks like we've got some questions and some comments rolling in. The first one comes from Bill Wagner. Bill reports, most interesting and useful presentation. Thanks. I've spent the last 5 years working with the VA for PTSD since I left Afghanistan. My experience with the VA has been 90% positive. They have quite a number and variety of programs and various levels of involvement and participation. I recommend it for anyone with issues of flashbacks, paranoia, when in groups, problems with light flashes and large noises. I recommend investigation of the many options at the VA if you believe you have issues for which you need help. Thanks, Bill, for the comments. Sergeant Major Hall, Mike Hall writes in, what structure is now in place at the regiment and battalion to deal with behavioral issues, both prevention and dealing with the issues when they arise? How does this compare with the rest of the Army?
And Sergeant Major Hall, I'm not sure if you meant behavioral health issues or behavioral issues, but I'll address behavioral health issues. So we have, for every Ranger battalion, we have an embedded behavioral health clinic, and embedded behavioral health personnel, so people that are assigned to the organization. And so the rest of the Army is kind of moving away from that a bit. Actually, when I first got here, when I first got to regiment, there was the behavioral health department was trying to actually dissolve our Ranger clinic and tried to consolidate everyone to the same embedded behavioral health clinic, which is not embedded. And so we fought that. And as a result, we now have contractor personnel, like contract psychologists, contract social workers, thanks to SOCOM, who they work for us. They don't work for the hospital. And so we're able to provide that treatment for folks, and not just treatment, but we can do prevention stuff too. So the rest of the Army has this, they have bean counters, for lack of a better phrase. And so they have people who, they make sure that their behavioral health providers are seeing a certain number of patients per day. And you can't measure behavioral health effectiveness by the quantity of treatment. And so some people in the rest of the Army it's 3 weeks before they can see somebody. And we pride ourselves in next day care, sometimes same day care. But we're much more focused on quality of treatment. And because we have contractors that work for us, we don't have to worry about hitting those numbers. And so we can have those contractors go out and get in front of our folks, do some prevention classes, things like that. There's a couple other things that we're working on. There's one program that I tried to kick off right before I left, and I passed it over to my replacement. But we're calling it the Ranger Peer Leader Program. And the idea is in every platoon, we identify, or command actually identifies a Ranger, a junior enlisted Ranger, who has exceptional social skills, who is someone who really cares about his guys, is kind of a natural leader. And we train them up to identify risk issues in terms of suicide, to talk to their fellow Rangers, like give them some skills to like amateur therapy kind of skills. But the most important thing is that they're the liaison between the platoon and behavioral health folks. And they're going to know before anybody if a Ranger's struggling. And so they can consult with us, and then we can provide them feedback, and then they can connect that person with us. And because the thing with suicide, when you look at the research on suicide, the only way you can really, or the best way you can get somebody to kill themselves, is you put time and distance between their suicidal ideation and their ability to act. And so the quicker you are at acting when somebody's suicidal, then the higher your chances are of preventing that suicide. And so if a Ranger buddy sees his fellow Ranger struggling, he can jump in there and intervene, and then get them the treatment that they need more quickly than if we didn't have that. So I hope I answered your question, Sergeant Major, but those were the two things that popped up for me.
Okay, Ranger O'Brien asks, for many, intuition and instinct is to avoid re-exposure to trauma situations. However, you say, please correct me if I'm misrepresenting you, that re-exposure done properly, gradually, infrequently at first, then increased when ready on improvement, will succeed in decreasing symptoms. Can you give an estimate as to success rate?
Yeah. So let me clarify and make sure I explain that appropriately. So when I say re-exposure, I mean when you're exposed to a traumatic event, there's all these other things that get encoded as a traumatic event in your brain, or as trauma or danger in your brain. And so some of these things are things like certain sounds that are harmless, or certain smells, or things like that. And so for you, as you're living your regular everyday life, you may come across those smells or those sounds that cause distress for you. So maybe you're shopping with your significant other and a car backfires, or maybe you smell some kind of burning smell and it brings you back to something from combat. And so the point is to take those smells and sounds and to break that association with danger. And the way you do that is you expose yourself to those things alone, slowly and gradually. So you pick the ones that are as least anxiety provoking as you can, on your list. and work your way up to the top. So you do it slowly and gradually. The success rate on that, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it is the gold standard for treatment for something like PTSD or trauma. So if done right, so that's the key. If done right, the success rate is incredibly high, but it's hard treatment. If you wanted to do it, you wouldn't need to do it. It's something that it's tough, but as you do it, and if you let yourself be exposed to these things, then it's going to be effective. You just have to be patient with it and give it time. And I would recommend doing it with the help of a professional. Going to the VA, as one of the individuals said earlier, had a very positive experience with the VA. So I would recommend doing it with a professional.
Ranger Hensler asks if you can talk about how the leadership structure is emphasizing the importance for junior Rangers to come forward, and talks about how it seems, at least in his period during the 1980s, this was a problem. Junior leaders were discouraged at the fire team level and squad level as showing weakness, and wonders how the regiment and how the battalions are addressing that concern today.
Yeah. I've been super impressed with the team leaders that have called me to consult with someone. And, I think one of the things too that is beneficial about this unit is that you have your behavioral health personnel embedded within the unit. And so we're a trusted asset. I've had many people just call me or swing by and say, "Hey, I'm worried about this individual. What do you think I should do?" And they're not worried about it hurting that person's career or anything like that. I've had some situations where I've had Rangers hit me up and say they're worried about this person, or I've called a fellow a Ranger buddy and said, "Hey, I'm worried about your friend here. I'd like you to keep an eye on him over the weekend." And what's interesting is the fire that I hear in the voices of these guys, where they say, "Sir, I'm on it. I got it." They're extremely motivated to help these guys out, or to help each other out and make sure they're here. So I haven't seen as much stigma there as what I expected going in. I've actually been really impressed with it. And then also too, this new generation coming up, Generation Z, there's some negatives to them. They're less resilient than previous generations, and they're less independent, but they're also pretty receptive to behavioral health treatment, which I think is a positive thing. And I've seen that play out with some of the junior enlisted folks. I actually went and I mentioned that Ranger Peer Leader program. I went up to 275 and did the first iteration of training for that a couple months ago. And I tried to explain what mindfulness was to the group. And I was shocked that all of them were probably more experts on mindfulness than I was. They knew exactly what it was. They showed me the apps that they were using. And I actually hesitated and this is a mistake on my part, a bias on my part, is I hesitated to actually bring up mindfulness for this group, because I thought that they might kind of scoff at it and think it was too, hippie-like or whatever. But they surprised me. They were super open to it and already knew more about it than I did. Yeah, all that to say, I've been pretty impressed with the receptiveness of the young leadership when it comes to behavioral health.
We have a question here from Ranger Elm, who wants to know if there are genetic factors that can play a role with struggles that individuals are having with PTS or PTSD, and if you can address some of those factors that may not be necessarily environmental.
Yeah, Ranger Elm, you're impressed me with your neuropeptide Y knowledge there. Yeah, so in all transparency, I'm actually not I'm not up to speed completely on some of the genetic literature. A lot of that stuff is new. A lot of it's emerging. But I mean, there's definitely some stuff out there that shows that people can be predisposed to developing PTSD or having reactions to traumatic events. When you take a large group of people and you expose them to trauma, most people are not going to develop PTSD. It's a small percentage that will, and it varies. It varies on the complexity of the trauma. So it's hard to put an actual number on that. But I will tell you, ethically, that's one of the things, one of the big reasons, one of the reasons behind why we do RASP is, especially RASP 1. We do interviews for RASP 1 now. And when I get people who have a lot of anxiety, pre-existing anxiety, or a lot of vulnerabilities, it's ethical for us to send them to a unit like a Ranger Regiment, because they are statistically more likely to develop problems if they're exposed to trauma, or even the high up tempo of the organization. They're less likely to be able to handle it compared to some other folks who are more resilient. So long answer to say I don't know, but I definitely think there's some research that's emerging in that area.
So we do have another question from Mike from Sergeant Major Hall, but before we jump on that, I got a direct message here from somebody who would like you to speak a little bit about your experience of going through Ranger School as a non-infantry guy. Most of the rest of us came from a different background. You're coming in with more of a professional background, not somebody who necessarily expected to go and crawl around in the dirt like those of us who spent time in the infantry school before we got to the Ranger Regiment. And if you could talk about not only what your experience was like, but what skills and what you took away from that school that helped you professionally now later in your career.
Yeah. Oh man, we could talk about that for hours. Yeah. So Ranger School is the most amazing social psychology experiment that you could ever send a psychologist through. I've always wanted to know what it's like to experience hallucinations, and thanks to Ranger School, I got to experience that. I think the biggest thing that I took away from Ranger School, number one, is I was a soup sandwich. I didn't know what I was doing. You don't get your tab alone. That definitely. I was very grateful to have some young Rangers that were in my same squad that helped me out. But number two, I think the biggest takeaway for me from Ranger School was it can always, like, things can always get worse. So I rarely had a bad day after Ranger School. There were times where I appreciated driving in my own car or walking outside and kind of enjoying the weather. And I don't know, there was just this element, my appreciation for things was recalibrated. And I'm a big believer that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and hard things, give people different perspectives. And so, yeah, I don't know. Like I said, we could talk about this for hours, but it was a very worthwhile experience, and probably that paired with my time at Regiment would easily some of the most developmental times of my life.
So Mike Hall asks if you can talk a little bit about the experience of long service guys who have spent 20 plus years in doing lots of crazy things over an extended period of time, always at that edge, and then the struggles that sometimes they experience with PTS or PTSD once they hit that stopping point and move on to the civilian world.
Yeah. I think for this one, and again, I'm not going to be the expert here because I've not been through that. You guys have been through that. But there's a few things with this one. One is I worry about folks who part of their identity is being a Ranger. Part of their identity is doing this kind of work, and then they leave and do something else, and they feel like a piece of them is missing. And so I know that's more on the psychological side, but for me, I think it's incredibly important, going back to what I said earlier about identifying what your values are, and making sure you're actively, deliberately plugging those activities in line with those values into your day. I'm reading, I should have read this a long time ago, but I'm finally reading Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And I'm sure folks in this group are familiar with that book. But Viktor Frankl, he's somebody who he was a Holocaust victim and a psychologist, and he came out of it, wrote a book on his experience and kind of some of the realizations that he had from it. But he said something that really stuck with me, and that he said that to survive in life is to find meaning in life. So the meaning of life is to survive, but to survive is to find meaning. And so I think for these folks that have spent the majority of their lives in regiment doing something incredibly important, I think it's going to be important to identify what the values are that gave you so much fulfillment in regiment, and figure out how to do those on the civilian side. That is on really more the psychological piece. Now the physical piece is a whole nother beast, because you guys have beaten your bodies up pretty good. And unfortunately, I'm not an expert on that physical piece. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I'm maybe not answering completely the question, but I'll pause there.
So this next question from Ranger Brewer is sort of dovetails into the last question. So I'm going to read it, and then I may spin it a little bit at the end. Ranger Brewer asks, what do you recommend for Rangers leaving service, both this generation and those who've been out for a while, who are struggling with the transition to civilian life, the loss of support provided by the active duty Ranger community, comradeship, lifestyle, and value is something that our guys are still struggling with years after they leave service. To kind of tie this question into, this overlaps a little bit with Sergeant Major Hall's question, but I think that one distinction I might make is, are there differences in the recommendations you would make for guys who are leaving after 4 years, 6 years, sort of shorter term active duty service guys, as opposed to those guys who have spent 20, 25 years plus in service? Are you seeing differences between the populations? And two, would you make recommendations differently depending on the length of service?
Yeah, I'd probably make the same recommendations really in terms of values. Because I mean, even if you spent 4 years in regiment, I mean, I just spent 5 years in regiment, and it made a significant impact on my life. Being surrounded by individuals that are of that high caliber, and feeling like you're a part of it. I mean, it's intoxicating, but it's also, when you get out and you're no longer part of that, it leaves a void. And so, I think if you're not active and deliberate, I think you can find yourself in an existential crisis there. The second thing I would recommend is, I recommend get yourself a coach. And what I mean by that is, they have executive coaches out there. And honestly, executive coaching and therapy are basically the same thing. Both processes are the same. You go from point A, you're trying to get from point A to point B, and you got a professional helping you out with the process. The only difference in therapy is that there's a specific set of tools that are trying to address a certain disorder like depression or PTSD or whatever. And so I would highly encourage someone to, if they were transitioning out, to see if you can get a hold of a coach. And the International Coaching Federation has a website. They have a list of coaches and stuff you can contact. Some of them are ridiculously expensive. Nobody's worth that much. You can find somebody for a reasonable price. But I mean, there's no reason for you to go through this alone. And a coach is not going to give you advice. They're not going to tell you what to do, because when you look at the research, that doesn't work. People don't like being told what to do. But what they'll do is they'll give you that space, and they'll question you, and they'll kind of help you walk down the path that you needed to go. So all that to say is my advice wouldn't be different in terms of make sure you know what your values are and make sure you're living those values. And then two, don't do it alone. Make sure you either have somebody from the community that can help you out, or get yourself a coach. And again, you can always, if you have access to a therapist, you can always use them in the same way. Just tell them that's the treatment goal. That's what you want to work on.
Well, I wanted, on behalf of the U.S. Army Ranger Association, Jeremy, I wanted to thank you for coming and spending some time with us tonight. Thank you for being a speaker for the Distinguished Speaker Series. We'd love to have you back in the future after you get to spend a little time at your new unit and get a little bit more research and knowledge under your belt, that you might be able to come back and tell us all of the new things that are going on in this sector of the world. I also wanted to thank those that were able to join us tonight. We've been really excited to see how well received this program has become over the last year that we've been dealing with COVID. I realize that everyone's sort of looking at the light at the end of the tunnel with the vaccines now being rolled out, and certain jurisdictions that are rolling back some of the limitations that they had before. Our hope is to continue this program into the foreseeable future. It's been well enough received that we think it's got some merit to continue even once all the restrictions from COVID end. And so we hope that you'll come back and join us next quarter. We are scheduled to have retired Command Sergeant Major Rick Merritt join us in July. We're very excited to have him as former boss of mine. I guess I'm excited to see him again as well and hear all the things that he's been up to these days. So with that, we'll wish everyone a good evening. We hope to see you at the Ranger Rendezvous and Annual Ranger Muster that's coming up in July. And we wish all of the guys from ARTB and the regiment and the Rangers everywhere best of luck this weekend at the Best Ranger competition. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.